right. We'll go ahead and get started, and we'll just let people trickle in as we go over our usual logistics. So if you are new to the Clinical Athlete Community, or this is your first journal club, welcome. As far as participating, you've got a few options. You can join the conversation like a radio show, unmute yourself and turn your camera on or not, just ask your question through voice. Just because we may have a bigger group here, the way that works best is if you type your question or your comment in the chat, but before the question or comment, type the word question in all caps. And that will be our signal that you would actually like to join in verbally and or with your video into the conversation. We'll just call on you and tell you to unmute yourself, and you can join right in. If you'd rather not speak up or show your face, but you still want the question to be asked or the comment to be discussed, you can just type it in the chat without the question tag in the beginning of it. And Megan will read that out loud, and we can use it for discussion. And as always, you can always just be an active listener and soak up the conversation that way as well. We will do breakout rooms like we have been the last few meetings. That'll be towards the kind of the middle of the journal club, where we can break out into smaller groups and you guys can discuss the topic. And these meetings are open to anyone that wants to join in. So if you have friends or colleagues that would geek out on this stuff, and tell them to join in on in the next meeting. We run these about once a week, so they're open for anybody, and we do record them, and we will send everybody who registers the recording in the next couple of days, and you'll have access to that for 7 days. So make sure you watch it when we send it, and then the recording will go in the Clinical Athlete Forum for safekeeping with all of the other great resources for athlete health and performance. And I'm copy and pasting a link to the Clinical Athlete Forum application there in the chat. You can open that up if you're interested. I'm also going to link the paper. So in the chat, a lot of you probably read the paper or have it in front of you, but if you didn't, I just put a link in the chat to the PDF. So if you click on that, you'll actually get the full PDF, and that PDF includes the supplemental material at the end of the paper as well. So click on that link, and now we should all be on the same page with what we're going to be talking about. And just a quick note on sound: if you were unmuted to join the conversation and then later on you're not speaking, just try to remember to mute yourself again, and that way no background noise comes into the discussion. Otherwise, feel free to use the chat as just kind of a side conversation. If you've ever been on like a Facebook or YouTube live event, the chat's just kind of going while the main discussion is being had. So feel free to use the chat for memes, for trolling Kevin, whatever, however you'd like to utilize that. With all of that said, welcome to the Clinical Athlete Journal Club number 29. My name is Quinn Hennick. I'm a proud clinical athlete provider, and I am joined by Kevin McNamara, who is a physical therapist in the Seattle area and a longtime Clinical Athlete Forum member, and the one who's responsible for bringing the Journal Club to life. And we're also so happy to see you back, Kevin. And we were worried about you. We didn't have you last week. We thought that you were on your deathbed, but you are back because you're young and resilient.
Exactly. I'm young, I'm resilient, and you guys got to put up with me for a little while longer. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank goodness. We were going to talk about sleep, but I didn't want to put people to sleep by myself. So I'm glad you're here, man.
I'll do my best.
We are also joined by our Clinical Athlete Journal Club intern, Megan Broussard, who is a student PT down in Texas at UT Southwestern. Say hi to the people, Megan.
Hey, guys.
Megan is going to help us curate the questions, and she does a great job as always. So in case you all are curious about these meetings and why we did them, if this is your first journal club, these meetings are modeled after Benjamin Franklin. And way back in the day, he started a club called the Junto Club, and it was a mutual improvement club. So we got a bunch of really smart people in one room and talked about important topics and issues of the day, kind of like what we're doing here. And they had an important policy for their meetings, and that was that those meetings were conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. So we've taken on that motto here in the Clinical Athlete Journal Club. We're all on the same team. We're just trying to be less wrong, but we do encourage healthy discussion. So let's have some of that. And today's topic is sleep. And we've got a paper on sleep and the athlete. It's a narrative review and expert consensus statement. And it's new. It seems to be hot off the press. So we're going to talk about sleep, and hopefully this meeting does its job and you all have a great night's sleep tonight. And even, intra meeting, we've done our job. Well, we've got a couple polls just to get a feel for the room. I'm going to launch a question here. The one that we always do to start. We just like to know who you are. Are you a clinician? Are you a student clinician? Are you a coach? Student, coach, trainer? A lot of students in the house tonight. Sweet. I'll share that result with you. And then we've got another one that I'm curious to know about. And that is right here. So prior to reading this article, how did you assess sleep in the athletes that you work with? And if you didn't, that's one of the options. But I'm curious to see everybody's thoughts here. Some commercial wearables we can talk about. Sleep diary, cool. Sleep questionnaire, awesome. The Nearable. Photography device, nobody. And a lot of you just didn't, which is fair. I would say that I've have fallen on the informal conversation to sleep diary spectrum, much more skewed to the informal conversation side of things. But I think it'll be a really good discussion about this paper. So yeah, I'm not sure where to start on this. Sleep is important. Naps are good. Stop drinking all those energy drinks. I think those are my big takeaways. Kevin, what were your huge takeaways?
Yeah, so I struggle with topics like this sometimes because I often think that, especially if you're not kind of careful as a clinician, you can almost create this situation where you're kind of just sprinkling in these platitudes and telling people sleep is good, but if you don't really have anything to follow up that's kind of actionable for the person in terms of like altering it or providing some sort of framework for implementation, I think it gets tough. So the one thing that I liked about this article is I thought kind of having like the toolbox at the end kind of solves that problem for a lot of people, just providing like, yeah, we all know sleep is good, but if I'm just kind of telling you, hey, you should sleep more, well then, the person's like, well, yeah, but how should I kind of set up my day-to-day routine to kind of do that? So I think if you're not careful with kind of the framing around this as a clinician, it can come off as a little bit patronizing. But I think that providing some of the actionable stuff at the end of the article was helpful to me. I thought the one thing that was interesting was kind of the sleep banking idea. I didn't really realize that there was much sort of efficacy behind that, but I thought that was something that was interesting. So overall, I think it's a difficult place to be in as a clinician when you're trying to address some of this stuff. But as long as you have something like this that you can either provide as third-party source material as to why you should care about this, it also provides some additional follow-up into how you can maybe strategize ways to help the person improve their sleep quality. So I think it's useful in that sense. But again, it's not something that I'd say I have a lot of priority placed on as a clinician, just because I think that sometimes it can come across as kind of condescending if I'm just like, hey, you should sleep more. But I think that having some of these kind of things at the end of the article was helpful in that sense, and that it does provide sort of that intermediary step as to this is something that's important. Here are some ways that we can maybe address that, and just helping the person establish some sort of basic lifestyle guidelines, probably the most that I would get out of a paper like this.
So that you bring up a lot of great talking points there. I think we can jump off with. So I'll just start with my evolution of when we first chose this topic, which, by the way, people, our Instagram polls are what chose the topic. So we threw this out in the forum, and then you guys chose it. And I was like, okay, we're really going to talk about sleep. And it was like, we all pretty much agree that sleep is important. But then as I'm reading the paper and I'm thinking about it, I take that kind of like, yeah, duh, sleep is important. So, how are we going to fill this time? But at the same time, it's like I have conversations on a regular basis with the athletes that I work with who tell me that their sleep is shit. And we have this conversation, like, you realize all of these other things that we're trying to get you to do. It's very difficult when you're not eating, you're not getting enough calories, you're not sleeping. And then we're trying to tell you to, stick to, and we, the evidence with the relationships of pain sensitivity and stress and sleep deprivation, like, it's obviously important. And so I'm trying to take the stance of, if I'm still having issues with it with my athletes, and it's worth talking about, because we all agree that it is like, it's so important. It's like you said, it becomes almost platitudes if we're just kind of like hailing down from our hill and saying you should get your sleep. But I foresee this conversation going in the direction of actionable, what are the steps that we can take, the habit stacking steps, the essentially lifestyle and behavior change is what we're talking about here. If we're trying to improve these qualities, which is fucking hard. It's so hard. And it's hard enough to just get them to do a rehab plan, and then you stack nutrition and sleep habits on top of that. It's just very difficult. And then just like some things that are out of their control, like if it's a collegiate athlete or a professional athlete or whoever who's got, or work, they work night shifts. There's something, these factors that are out of control. But so, and again, guys, if you have thoughts, throw them in the chat and we'll get this party started. But just some bullet points that I had. I have not tried any type of any long-term usage of apps or recommendations of apps to the athletes that I work with. And mostly because of what was summarized in this paper, the lack of validation, the lack of reliability in the data, and mostly a black box way of presenting you the answer of. So what I mean by black box, and this is a term that's used in science quite a bit, is you have some type of input data and then it goes into a black box and you don't know what the hell happens. And then all of a sudden you have an output. The output is recovered. Your app tells you this. You're 78% recovered today. You're 32% recovered today. And you're like, oh shit. But how did you come to that number? And the authors in this paper even talk about that. Like it's hard for researchers to even get their hands on the raw data. Like, what are the algorithms that you're using? They're based on what? And a lot of these commercial based apps and tech devices are just that. They're that black box. And if I don't know how the hell we're getting to the conclusion that we're getting to, not recommending something like that.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think that's one of the things, right, with these proprietary algorithms, where, like, I think, to my knowledge, there's maybe one, I want to say the Aura Ring was maybe actually used in like the Journal of Sleep, to where they actually did kind of disclose how they're kind of coming up with some of their numbers. But the other thing that I think is interesting too, because I kind of geek out on like personality research, is base level like trait neuroticism is also associated with poor sleep quality. And if you're then having someone who is baseline neurotic that is using some sort of sleep tracker to tell them whether they're recovered or not, you're just kind of throwing gasoline on a fire there. And we know that personality is highly unmalleable. So in many ways, you can almost be doing more harm than good if you have someone that has poor sleep quality because they're neurotic at baseline, and then you're going to attempt to utilize some sort of proprietary algorithm to tell them whether or not they're recovered. I think in many ways that's probably doing more harm than good. So I think it's a difficult balance, man. I think it's something that's really hard to address. And like you said, it comes down to behavior change and just implementing actionable strategies. And if you don't have that, then I think it's hard to make a dent in this at all.
And with that problem, we get into Goodhart's law, which is this principle that states when the test becomes, or when the measure becomes the target, it's no longer a good measure. So what happens a lot of times is we have these apps and we see that our recovery is poor, and we start trying to figure out how to game the algorithm so that we can get the number. But that may have no effect on what you're actually trying to get at, which is improved performance long-term, improved recovery, these types of things. You're just gaming the number. And to your point, perhaps people who are a bit more neurotic and type A, that they're just more towards that. But when you start seeing that, it's like, oh, you start using that number to gauge how you feel about your training and your recovery and how you feel that things are going to go. And you don't even know how that tech is getting that number. The number shouldn't be the target. And especially if the number's being pulled from however the hell they want to create it. And those are kind of my thoughts on it. Now I still keep my ear to the ground on stuff like that. Lord knows I like data. So give me an excuse to start looking at these things, but that's just been my opinion on those types of things. And it was a bit confirmed with this paper here. The sleep assessment. So I've not in practice done more than had conversations about sleep and then kind of informal conversations about habit. And we'll talk about these types of things, nighttime routines, morning routines, all the nuts and bolts of what we can do to habit stack for long-term change. But, I'm looking at some of these sleep assessments and it may not be a bad, so I just pulled the one up that they talked about the most. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is the athlete sleep behavior questionnaire. And so just reading these, and I'll share the link with this paper. So this was the validation paper of this questionnaire that they talked about. So Shona Hallison was one of the authors. She's also one of the authors here on a main paper that we're talking about. And she's kind of in the sleep recovery, especially recovery and athlete monitoring. Shona Hallison is a household name in that space. But anyway, here's the questionnaire. And you can read all about the scoring systems and stuff like that. But these questions, I take afternoon naps, I use stimulants, I exercise, I consume alcohol, I go to bed at different times each night, I go to bed feeling thirsty. So it runs through all these questions where the score is one thing. And obviously you can track longitudinal change that way. And they actually recommend, cutoffs of potential referral. But at least as we talk about with a lot of these questionnaires, they can get a conversation going. You can be like, you get the answers on this questionnaire, and then you actually have a conversation with the human in front of you and say, all right, so, I noticed in number 2 here, you said you use stimulants when you compete, and you said, always. You start kind of talking about that maybe, or hell, I use sleeping pills to help me sleep. That's kind of a red flag. Somebody maybe with some type of chronic pain, they're using sleeping pills to sleep. So, I mean, there's some stuff here to spur conversations. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm not saying that I'm going to implement this in practice tomorrow, but it potentially something to think about. If maybe not in the beginning, but perhaps as a second line where you're not trying to throw everything at this athlete all in the very beginning, but you get to the point where you're working with them, and it might be now time to start talking about those deeper details like sleep and nutrition and these longer term habits. Maybe this is something that you throw into the mix. Kevin, had you seen that questionnaire?
I have not. So I'll be honest with you, I have not used any of some of the more empirical sleep-based questionnaires. I've done some with sleep apnea, something like the stop bang questionnaire. But in terms of stuff like this, I've not. And I think that kind of pokes at a deeper question is, when do you start to actually dig into some of this stuff? When it comes to time with, especially if you're in more kind of classic, clinic based, we know that the complex system is going to have all sorts of interactions. So I guess my question would be when do you start to dig into or address someone's sleep habits? You know what I mean? Is where on sort of the hierarchy of interventions is is that kind of for you?
I'll answer that real quick, and then we'll get to Derek and Jessica. And actually, and Derek says it's too long to type. I'll just say, yeah, it's probably a better strategy going forward, Megan, too. I'll just tell people to like type literally the word question, and then we'll know we can just unmute them. But yeah, I think, Kevin, in practice, what I typically do is I usually always ask about their sleep. Like, I just want to hear what they're going to say. Like, how's your sleep quantity? I ask it really informally, and just kind of hear what they say, have a conversation about it. If there's some people just say straight up, my sleep is not good, or, blah, blah, blah. It's then, okay. And obviously this is me talking to the person, you probably get that can have a bearing on some of this stuff. So that's maybe a conversation, put that in the back pocket for now, but that's maybe a conversation that's important to have in the near future. Is that cool with you? 10 times out of 10 say, yeah. So it's something like, at least it's opened in the beginning. And so it allows us to enter that door later on if we need to, but a lot of times it doesn't go beyond that in the very beginning. And then if things seem to not be going as well, or they're kind of up and down still over the period of time where we would have liked to see some type of trend in the right direction, then we might revisit, all right, we got to start talking about some lifestyle habits here and dig into that a little bit more, nutrition, sleep. So that's kind of how I go about it. Derek, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of a question and a thought, but do you think with a lot of these topics and these papers, we get so stuck in the specifics, like it's just a trend, like a new trend that we get caught up in because we've seen it with like modalities, biomechanics, P&E, where it's this new idea or this thought where we get this overarching amount of evidence. And then we kind of put everybody into, well, you need more sleep if you want to function better, perform better, things like that, instead of what you guys have already mentioned, where it's probably more person dependent or athlete dependent, where you can spark a conversation to see, where they're at and how they're handling things, but it's probably not going to be the end all be all, and that there might be other things that you're going to have to address because sleep may not be what is going to change or a behavior that they're willing to change.
Yeah. I think on a topic like this, definitely, it's like we all agree at a base level that sleep is important. Like nobody's really disagreeing with that. But then you do see like the pendulum just swings and all of a sudden everybody's just talking about sleep. And then everybody stops talking about sleep. And then a year and a half later, a consensus statement comes out, and then like the sleep is all the rage again. It's like, oh, sleep's important again. And here we are talking about it. But I agree with you, especially the point that you made where it's like, what are we going to be able to change? What's going to give us the most bang for buck? Now, if they could guarantee at a snap of a finger, they were going to change their sleep habits tomorrow, that might be the thing that actually gives us the most bang for buck. But because that's probably not going to happen, and we're not there to, appraise their sleep situation, like we're not their sleep consultant. We're just seeing them for a very short period of time, usually compared to all the rest of the time that they have away from us. Like you said, like, what are we going to actually be able to make a dent in the time that we have together? And the biggest dent, I don't know if it can be sleep, unless you're going to be working with this person longer term. And then even then it's going to be like small changes over time. So I agree with you. But I also think it comes back to this idea of commercialization of sleep, essentially, which Cassie, to your question, and I'll unmute you because I know you typed a question, but you asked about the thoughts on the Whoop app, and you said you believe it's more recovery than specific to sleep. It still does have a specific sleep component, but the Whoop falls into the bucket for me of the black box. I've looked into it. I can't get an answer. I've even emailed them to ask for referrals, and I always just get sent to the website. There's like I can't get any information as to how they're getting the red, green, yellow, the recovery scores, these types of things. So something to be said on that is, even if the data were skewed, that's almost okay. I just want it to be reliable. So, I have athletes who use the Whoop, and they tell me yeah, some days I feel great and it says the recovery is a bit off. And then some days I feel like garbage and it says like, you're raring to go, you should run through a brick wall. And it's like, I don't know if I should trust this piece of equipment over what they feel. And the other side of it is if it's based on heart rate variability, that's a lagging indicator, meaning that's not a metric that essentially is like a snapshot of your current readiness. It's something that kind of accumulates up and down. So if you're in the red and in terms of heart rate variability, you've probably been trending that way over time rather than you're recovered today versus not. So that's kind of my thought on it.
Yeah, I guess I'll just follow up with that.
Please.
One of my best friends is a professional cross-country mountain biker, and she always posts about it on Instagram, and I'm sure she's probably also maybe like sponsored by them or something that would be more of a reason why she posts, but she kind of seems to swear by it. And I think it's just for her to be able to send, I think her coach uses it because it is such an individualized training sport, that her coach uses it almost just to like make her workouts from, because she's doing a lot of this by herself, especially right now. So I just wasn't sure because she seems to really like it and seems to like use it as like, okay, I just went through a major training block and now I took, a week to do more of this light load. So I just wasn't sure if you had any kind of thoughts on it, but it totally does make sense of like the black box. I agree that I think it's something that makes her feel probably better when she does have those good recovery days after these large training blocks. And then kind of also on the other side of things though, she'll kind of feel like she needs to recover more when she doesn't have the recovery that she was supposed to have with that app. So I don't know, she just seems to use it a lot. So I was kind of just seeing your opinion.
Well, and you're not going to, if I ever have a conversation with this person, you're probably not going to hear me say, I should get rid of it. That's bullshit. Like clearly, because the interactions between that and your perception of it working, whether or not, because it wouldn't work. Honestly, like I'm so biased against the tech at this point. I would need like a lot, even if you gave it to me, I would probably not like it. But if you're already kind of into it and it's not totally screwing you up, then you're probably going to like it. So it kind of also matters how you're coming into it. But I'll say this, when people thought that the world was flat, they created maps that allowed them to travel the world in a pretty reliable way. So my point there is the model can be wrong, but if the model is reliable, you might be able to get out what you need to get out of it. So if the Whoop data ultimately is wrong in the sense of like, if we found some gold standard for recovery or sleep compared to Whoop to it, but as long as it's wrong the same amount every time, the coach and the athlete will start to recognize those patterns, and essentially you'll just orient yourself to that model. And that's an overly simplistic way of saying reliability before validity, if anything, the lesser of two evils. But that's just my overall thoughts on it. I have no doubt that there are many athletes that probably use it and are crushing it. So lots to be determined on that stuff.
Going back to Jessica's question, she had said that if you're a trainer who works with athletes on a regular basis weekly, you could probably just ask these questions and add it to your notes. I don't know. Yeah.
So essentially the question is, couldn't you just add, like when I brought up that questionnaire, can't you just ask these things? I think the one thing that you're missing there is potentially the longitudinal change that an outcome measure provides you. So if this was about like ACL rehab and we wanted to know their fear avoidance and we were using like the RSI or the Tampa scale or something like that, we can like ask, or we could probably pick up on fear avoidance and kinesiophobia and these types of things, but we can track longitudinal change with these objective outcome or quantitative outcome measures. So, but ultimately, yeah, we can ask them these things. It also just gives us a nice little list of questions in case we forget what to ask. Kevin, you have any thoughts on anything that was
No,
mentioned?
I mean, I just dropped a link in the chat there. So that was comparing the Aura ring to the polysomnography, which is kind of like the gold standard. And it did seem to have some crossover there. But in terms of some of like the more commercial wearables, like that's the only thing that I've seen that's really ever been put up against kind of like the gold standard sleep tracker. So I guess if you're kind of wanting to explore more of the wearable technology, at least that's been something that has been investigated to a certain degree. Again, I kind of wonder if how much some of this matters, if like from a programming standpoint, if you're using more of like an auto-regulatory approach. I think that's where the real value from that comes in, because you're going to be a different organism every time you step in the gym, right? So can we almost just sidestep some of the sleep stuff if you are changing your programming to more of that auto-regulatory approach? Because essentially that kind of, it's not a parachute, but it allows you to at least have some sort of, you're not so constrained in your programming, because that accounts for how that person's feeling on that day, whether it's sleep related or not. So sometimes I wonder if we can just get kind of too caught up and into the weeds with some of this stuff, where if we just change from a programming standpoint, can we not just kind of account for that in a secondary way?
Yeah. And with Cassidy's example, with that like super high level, very super specific athlete, individual athlete, her coach is probably writing her like they probably have a very close relationship and to the T, training and their daily schedule. It makes sense that something like this could be incorporated because you're so in tune with what's happening. But any level beyond that, where you don't have that much connection with the athlete or are not able to invest that amount of time, it's tougher. And that's even assuming that the data that you're getting is meaningful to you. So the Oura Ring has been around for a while too. So yeah, that's something to explore for people. A couple of things that popped out at me was the caffeine thing. Not that it was surprising, but the paper that they referenced, or perhaps more than one paper, saying that the effects of caffeine can last up to 16 hours after ingestion. I mean, think about the half-life being like 6 hours, I think, but it can still kind of have those physiological arousal effects like way late. And in the same breath, they recommended coffee naps, which I got a kick out of, which I have tried the coffee nap. So in the paper, the coffee nap the caffeine nap is you ingest a little bit of caffeine and then you go and take a nap immediately. And by the time you wake up from your like 30-minute nap, the caffeine hits. So you like wake up ready to, run through a brick wall. But when are you usually taking naps? Like early afternoon, kind of, so would that not affect potentially sleep later on? I don't know, but I thought that was funny.
Quinn, I'd like to pick up on where Kevin was with his, do you think autoregulation covers us? I mean, I think it depends upon the chronicity of the sleep deficit, wouldn't you think? I mean, if it's a day or two that's off, that's one thing. But if we've got a chronic sleep deficit, I'm not sure autoregulation, because we're just kind of regulating down to a low performance, not necessarily regulating to where we need to be.
Well, when you guys say autoregulation, what do you mean exactly?
I'm assuming he was talking about reps in reserve or some other type of session RPE or something where they're able to come in and say red light, green light, and then, and then utilizing that to self-regulate what kind of level that they're going at. Is that what you meant, Kevin?
Yeah, in terms of like instead of having very constrained sort of percentage-based stuff, utilizing more of an RPE that will allow for some sort of day-to-day variability to where you're not necessarily missing the desired training effect for that day if you were using something that was much more constrained, like a percentage-based. But I think I would probably agree with you in saying that if it is more of a chronic issue, at some point there'll probably be a level to where RPE is not going to be able to cover our bases, so to speak.
So Paul, I guess maybe RPE could allow you to see if it's starting to become like a longer term trend, in which case, I don't know what the intervention is other than revisiting a conversation that you've probably had in the past, or maybe for the first time, and then starting to get on their ass a little bit about these lifestyle changes. But I'll just anecdotally, I use session RPE, and I have kind of this simplistic mental model with it, but I don't track session RPE and like session RPE load the way they do in the literature, looking at arbitrary units over time and these types of things. But what I do is I have the lifters that I program, or the athletes that I program for, give me the amount of time that the workout took them and their session RPE from 0 to 10 using the category ratio 10 scale, the 0 to 10 scale that most of us are familiar with. And what I look at is the relationship between their external output and the session RPE compared to previous weeks. So the way that I program is usually microcycles repeated until we see trends, plateau trends or things like that. And then we switch it up and pivot. But if I'm seeing session RPEs steady or even decreasing and performance output increasing, I'm like, oh, okay. Like, you're crushing it right now. We're adapting favorably. Let's ride this wave. Then what happens is that starts to tail off a little bit. So performance output starts to kind of plateau or even downtick from week to week. But then I see session RPE start to slowly uptick. So now you're perceiving these sessions as harder and your output is not better. So I deem that as, okay, we're kind of like squeezing all the juice out of this lemon. It may be time to at least have a conversation about switching things up, deload, pivot, these types of things. So I don't know if this is anything of what you're getting at, Paul, but for me, auto-regulation at least allows me to even see if there are some of these negative trends.
Oh yeah. No,
Okay.
I mean, I was just trying to get clarity, because I just think that if we just think that we're just at auto-regulation and that covers us for any sleep debt and some of the other things, I think sleep does a hell of a lot more than just performance aspects. It's a critical component, and we can't just squeeze it too low and think that we're covering our bases because things look good on the workout side. Eventually that's going to lead to a crash, especially if you're not having regular contact with an athlete. You may not have that feedback cycle at a small enough cycle to where they're already down in the dumps before you're able to make an adjustment,
Yeah. So for you, do you have, are you talking about sleep with, the person in front of you as soon as you can?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of my intake questionnaires type stuff, right? I'm looking at sleep because I suck at sleep. So I know its effects, right? And so I'm going to make sure that I try to broach that subject with every client that comes through, whether it be a patient or just a actually athlete client.
To Kevin's question earlier, if you get some type of yellow, red flag and pertaining to sleep habits, are you starting to give some actionable items right then and there, or how does that conversation go?
Conversation is usually based off of, okay, what do you know about sleep? Right. So I want to know where they are, where their education, where their thought process is. And then what are the barriers? Because you're telling me that we're only getting a consistent 5 hours. So why is that? Right. Because life sucks. Sometimes you got a little kid, you got this, and you're still trying to get your workout in, and you're not going to be able to control that. I'm not going to be able to intervene on those factors. Well, it's like, because I like to go have a 6-pack with my buddies every night, and we hang out till 12, and I got a 5 a.m. workout, and I'm a man, and I'm going to show up at my workout. That's great, but you're showing up with your buddies and drinking that beer is not helping us, right? And so then we can have both a diet and a sleep conversation, right? So it gets me to where, what are those kind of things, and where is it right to intervene, and where, okay, this is just a life that's where they are, right? And I'm not going to be able to do anything, because handing them a pamphlet of, here's your 7-step for sleep hygiene, that's great. But if they already know that shit, most people kind of already know it, just like they know they're not supposed to smoke and they're already smoking, that shit's not going to do anything for them. And so I try to figure out where the barriers are and see what we need to do about individual barriers.
Yeah. I've been getting a lot of feedback lately about like hangovers. Like people, I'm looking at like my program and like I'll either see it's an Excel sheet and it's just not filled out. And then in the little notes, like was way too hungover. I'm sorry. I'm like,
Part of that's Corona, dude. Part of that's
yeah,
just
I
the
know.
COVID.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're totally right. And that's, I've seen that with me, you know, more time in front of electronics, like my habits
Yeah.
have faltered.
No doubt.
So, I mean, it's big. And I think Matt kind of in the chat alludes to that a little bit where, you know, trying to like focus on sleep in a vacuum. Like, all right, you're going to get your sleep dialed in, and then we're going to get your nutrition dialed in. And then we're really going to be able to hit training hard. It's like all of these things incorporate so many little habits that have built up over the course of years to get this person to where they currently are with these lifestyle habits. It's very difficult to know where to start. But
well, what's one of the things I talk about in rehab? You can't get well in the environment that you got sick in, but most of us are going to be in our consistent environment that we're sick in if we're not sleeping and eating shitty and doing all those other kind of things, right? Unless you move out of the house and get a new thing. So how do you change those environmental triggers and everything else that you already have in place?
And I think that's where we go. That's where we take this. So I would like to, we're going to break out and talk about those exact things. So in your breakout rooms, what we want you guys to talk about, I'll put the prompts in the chat, is like what habits? Okay, actionable items. So here are the prompts, 2 of them. What are strategies that you've implemented for you, you know, as a person, as an athlete, or have recommended to the people that you work with in terms of chipping away and improving these things long term? And we can come back and talk about these things. Because I think there's definitely some things to be shared that I think will be super, super useful. And I can share things that have worked for me and that haven't. But let's do that. We're going to break out in rooms. So if you don't want to do that, then go ahead and just leave the meeting now so that we don't have a breakout room full of like 0 people. And I'll give you an extra minute to dip out. Okay. I'm going to make 3 rooms and we're off. Okay. We are back. Hopefully we have solved all of your sleep problems. So if we go into actionable things here, I'll give, gosh, there's so many things that could be talked about in terms of these little habits that can be stacked. And I keep saying this term of habit stacking. This is just a term that I've gotten from reading books like Atomic Habits and The Power of Habit and these types of things, where if you try to change so many things at once, you end up not changing anything. So if you can just pick the next easiest habit, and that's why, you know, like making your bed in the morning, that's why they talk about the importance of that. It has nothing to do with making your bed. And from a logical standpoint, it makes no sense because the bed's just going to get messed up. But it's the fact that you're doing something to set the day in motion. And that's one thing. It's like brushing your teeth or anything that you have done for years. You don't even think about it, but you used to not do that at some point. And then you made it a habit and now it's just a mainstay. And that's how these things work. So for me, I'll give a few things and I'd love to get your all's thoughts of your ideas in the chat. We can get you to come back on and talk to Kevin and Megan because they were in different groups. But for me, it's an evening and a morning routine. It's both. The morning routine sets the stage for the day and sets the stage for the nighttime routine and vice versa. They both work together. But in the evening for me, it's putting my phone, it's putting my phone away 2 hours before I tend to go to bed. And bedtime for me is like 10. I live on the West Coast, but it's the phone is one thing. I may be on my computer, which I have this app called Flux, which blocks the blue light. So that helps, but I may be on my computer, like reading or learning, but for me, that's much less stimulatory than being on my phone, just mindlessly scrolling social media or doing something completely non-productive. So I try to put my phone away. And what I've learned is that I have finite willpower and my willpower is usually depleted in the evening. So during the times that I should be putting my phone away, it is most difficult to put my phone away. So I stopped fighting my willpower, and I got this thing. It's called the brand is Kitchen Safe, but this thing is fucking amazing. So it's a lockbox, and you set the time. So I'll just set the time for like 2 minutes, but you click this button, and I put my phone inside of this thing, and it latches. I don't know if you heard that, but like if I have to take a sledgehammer to this thing to get it open. There is no, you have these things. Oh, I'll just put my phone in the other room. I'll put my alarm clock in the other room. No, you get up, you hit the snooze, and you go back to bed. I can't get my phone out of this thing unless I take a sledgehammer to it. And it was $50. So I don't want to do that. So like, that's something that's helped me, is the principle of putting electronics away, getting the stimulation out of my face, and actually getting some type of contraption where I didn't have to fight myself. So that was really helpful. The other thing in my evening routine that's probably the big rock is planning the next day, the evening of. Not waking up in the morning and saying, okay, half asleep, like already, anxious about all the things that I have to do. Okay, what should I do today? No, I do that the night before. And that way, when I wake up, everything is already planned. I have a mission, I have a plan. There's no reason to deviate. And it helps me sleep because I feel more organized and ready for the next day. And I'm not sitting there laying in bed, thinking about planning. I should have done that prior. So those are two big ones for me. And a big thing in the morning routine is the first thing I do is not check my email, not check my phone. It's not let the world get to me for about the first hour. So this thing is still in the thing, but it's also not checking the firestorm that I'm sure is awaiting me. Waking up, getting breakfast, usually drinking coffee, but there's a buffer. So there's a buffer in the evening, there's a buffer in the morning. And now there's been enough time where I feel kind of fresh and almost like excited to get back to the world, as opposed to like keeping the world constantly on me and feeling like I can't get it away. So yeah, I wish I had if I had a coupon code, it would be in the chat right now. But I'll stop there. There's a whole lot of other stuff I could talk about, but I'll throw it to Kevin and see what his group talked about. And then feel free to give other thoughts in the chat.
Yeah, Journal Club 29 brought to you by Kitchen Lockbox.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, so we had a lot of the same sort of things that we talked about. I set my day up very similar. I kind of joked that like I'd be the easiest payday for a hitman ever, because my days by the hours are pretty much the same. Like I'll be here at this time. But I do something similar. So I try to block like 2 hours in the morning and then kind of 2 hours at night. Morning for me is kind of training time and things like that, just because I know that I'll always have that time available. And then at nighttime, I journal for sure. That's something that I have to do. And then I'm not quite as high tech as you, but I use little note cards to write out my 7 goals for like the next day. Like these are things that I have to get done. And that's kind of the way that I set it up. So kind of 2 hours in the morning to where either kind of getting ready to train or doing whatever I had to do, and then 2 hours at night to kind of reflect and kind of plan out the next day. So a lot of stuff very similar. And we talked about, habit stacking, right? It's kind of just building one thing on top of the other. And Paul mentioned, don't break the chain. It's very similar to kind of like some kind of like training too, right? It's just kind of consecutively stacking up those things and not thinking about, 30 or 60 days from now, but I'm implementing this habit today, and I want to make sure that I follow through with that on the next day. So I think bookending, morning and nighttime is something that's really helpful to me, because I know that it at least provides some sort of consistency and structure that I think sets me up and kind of facilitates, kind of keeps that momentum going. So I think picking a couple small things and just starting small and consecutively hitting them day in and day out kind of lays the framework and allows you to start to get a little bit more nuanced and add more things as you can. But I've found that to be really helpful, much like you, starting with a 2 hour block in the morning, 2 hour block at night, and just having some sort of consistency.
I'm not high tech, man. I got a notebook too. Like this is my life. It says get shit done, but this is my planner. It's in 15-minute increments. But that's awesome. Before I throw it to Megan and anybody else in the chat, there's one thing that I don't want to forget, but this is a tip that I've read in many, many different books and also just has worked for me as well, but so I said I go to bed at 10 on average, but if I'm not tired, I don't lay in bed trying to go to sleep because that tends to work against me. The longer I sit there in bed, the more anxious I am about not falling asleep. The more anxious I get, the less apt I am to fall asleep. So what helps me is just doing things until I actually get tired. Now, those things need to be not things that keep me stimulated. So again, the phone is a way, but things are like like organizing my desk or organizing laundry, like brainless tasks, but that just kind of start detaching me from the day a little bit. But I'm up and going and I slowly start getting sleepy. And I go to bed when I'm actually sleepy. My body's gotten to a habit of getting sleepy around 10 o'clock. So that's good. But sometimes it doesn't work like that. And every time I try to force it, that's when I end up just laying in bed until 2 a.m. So what works a lot better for me is not forcing it, getting up and just doing these mindless tasks that end up being productive anyway. And that's helped as well. So I wanted to say that. Paul, fishing is definitely a stress relief for me. Sometimes not though. Like if I don't catch anything, I get pissed. So like, if anything, I'm up on Amazon looking at the next $15 lure that I'm going to end up losing on a rock. So that's stressful. It could work both ways, but I'm going to throw it to Megan and other people too. So Megan, what did you guys talk about in your group? And then anybody else who wants to chime in?
Yeah, so we kind of branched off and started talking about how specifically this first prompt with education and talking to your athletes about sleep could vary based on the population, just because Derek has more experience with kind of the college athlete, but then some of us were talking about, well, in a youth athlete, is it more like the parents that you're having to educate, and then how do you go about having that conversation and maybe gearing it more towards what is important to the parent and kind of meeting them there and having the conversation of, look, if like performance is important, maybe you need to address sleep because that will affect performance type thing. So we kind of went that route.
Paul, I'm curious, from the questions or Paul or Kevin or anybody that works with a ton of youth athletes or has in the past, because I haven't worked with all that many youth athletes in which I'm talking to their parents about the athlete's sleep, even though it's important. I'm just thinking about it. I don't have experience with that. Do you guys?
Depends upon what we're calling youth. I mean, if we're
Right.
talking teenagers, I want them to have that locus of control. So I'm talking to them. You know, if we're talking a 10 or 12-year-old, then yeah, I'm having to talk to the parents. And I've treated those that are athletes that young. And really it kind of comes down to what are the parents' habits, because some of these families, mom's working 2 jobs or dad's working 2 jobs, and the only time they get to see the kid is if the kid's up late, right? And then it's which is more important, the relationship with the parent and the child, or the kid getting sleep for sports or school performance. And I roll school performance in at that point, because this is universal. It's both for growth, it's for health, it's for, you know, school performance, athletic performance. So we're going to, you know, hit all those buttons with the parents to try to push as many buttons as we can. But in the end, they're making a determination of, is time spent with child, with dad, just as important as the sleep? And I can't answer that for them. It's always back in their court.
So it kind of just goes back to bringing the subject up as something to consider. And then ultimately it's, you know,
right. I mean, we
their
can only
choice.
ask, are you willing to make this change? Are you capable of making this change? Are you doing that? But these are big asks for some people in their situation. Context matters always in life, right? And so for some of these people at that point, they're not going to be able to make those adjustments, even if it's possibly the best thing. And I go into behavior with some of those younger kids, right? Because if they're sleep deprived, especially even younger than that, I don't treat anybody younger than that, but anybody younger than that, behavior starts to break down. Yeah. Multiple sleepless nights, and then now they're getting labeled as the bad kids in school, and that has a whole detriment all the way across, right? And it oftentimes go back to sleep. But I don't treat anybody that young, but that's a conversation. How do you tell a mom or dad not to spend time with their child? And the only time they're going to get to is when they're home from their second job, and that's 10 o'clock, and the kid's going to be up again at 5 with you for your other job. That's a tough thing. They need 12, 14 hours, and you're only going to give them 8. You're thinking you're doing a great job, but they're still sleep deprived for what they need. You can't make that call for their family.
So when the topic was first posed, I was kind of picturing the 8 to 13-year-old, and that's the behavior thing is where I've had the experiences. Sleep has come up as a subtopic of behavior problems in school. So it'll be like conversations that I'm having with the parent, and they'll just tell them, kind of telling me that they're having issues with behavior, and then he or she doesn't sleep, and is getting in trouble in school, and so it's lots of stuff happening, and we end up just talking about figuring out what the kid likes and looks forward to, and if we can provide any of that, like if I can help provide any of that, at minimum make whatever they're coming to see me for kind of a fun experience. And if that's all I can contribute, and that's like a little stress relief in their life, a little respite, maybe that helps downstream.
Right. Well, and some, you get into weeds with someone talking to some of these people, and the stress levels that are in the homes is astounding of what some people are dealing with. Right. And so, sleep isn't the only issue in many of these homes. Right. But again, if you can be an outlet, you can give them something time frame where they're getting a stress outlet, they're having a positive experience, and it's a positive thing in their life. Even if they're not sleeping, it may be a good win for us and for the kid at that point. But going back to the sleep, there's so many contextual layers with dealing with those kids, because there's other things, right? Are they ADHD? Are they this? Are they this? Is it this? Those things are all things that are going to play a role, right? And do we counsel on all of that, right? Who has the referral sources available to them, right? Who's in your Rolodex that you can call somebody up and talk to? Hey, I got this kid that needs this. Can they come see you? Right. And I'm a big proponent that we need to have a bigger Rolodex, right? I'm old. So yeah, in your phone, you need to have these people that you can call that are referral sources, even just to talk to, but possibly to hook somebody up with, so that, because we're not always able to handle at the level, because sometimes you're going to find out, ooh, this is well beyond me just having a conversation with mom or dad or the kid, and I need to get some help. And we need to be able to have that person that we know, that we trust. Because again, if we make that referral, it's going to look back on us. And so we need to have that broader scope of practitioners within our wheelhouse.
The electronic Rolodex.
Yeah.
Cassidy, go ahead and ask your question.
So kind of just going off of that, and Paul, you can answer if anybody has worked with youth athletes in general. I also feel like a big kind of struggle, because just based off my coaching experience, because I'm still a student, would be that these kids have school all day, and then a lot of times the field availability, and for my case, I was coaching water polo, the pool availability, they're like last on the totem pole. So a lot of these practices are 7 to 9 at night, 8 to 10 at night, and then they have school the next day. Or there's also the cases of, when I was coaching in high school, they have their high school practice, but then they're also part of a club team. So then that club team practices 7 to 9 or 8 to 10 at night, because they know that they have their high school team or their other team that they're a part of. And so I'm just wondering if, one, you've ever kind of said, hey, maybe you should not practice this at night. And that's obviously a whole different ball game of trying to get kids that think that missing one practice, and I was that kid, is the worst thing to ever happen to them. Or if you just kind of educate them on, going to sleep right when they get home. But it's hard when you have a practice 7 to 9 and then need to eat dinner or whatever it is after, before, and then you're, pretty stimulated from that practice. So I just don't know if you have any experience with that, or if anyone does.
I'll briefly answer and then throw it to the squad. But I don't think I've ever necessarily explicitly talked about missing practice. Maybe I have. You know, yeah, skip one or two and get an extra night's sleep. Probably not the worst thing in the world, but I usually, in my mind, the schedule is the schedule, as unfortunate as it is. If they want to play the sport, they're going to have to go to practice, even if it's just like showing face, so the coach knows they're invested in these types of things. But I think where I typically go is just making sure that the rest of that situation is as dialed in as possible. Like, one issue I see a lot is that the kids are underfed, they're under eating. Like, they've barely eaten anything, maybe anything for lunch that was like hours previously. And then they have this hard 2-hour practice, and then they may or may not eat anything for dinner, or just play video games for another 2 hours when they get home. It's those habits that we try to address. They're still as hard as any, especially with adolescents, but that's generally where I go. And if it's something like pick low hanging fruit, for me, it's food. Like, you're going to play video games until 2 a.m. or you're just like, if there's something to be had, at least eat. And if it's just having some protein bars and some, whatever the hell, I'm blanking on the names now, but like just the fast stuff, like eat something, get the calories in. At least that's one thing. Okay. We can start to tick that box off. Now let's talk about, your habit of staying up until 3 a.m. and you have to get up at 6:30 for school the next day and do it all over again. So it's like, it's addressing it that way. That's just typically the way that I would go about it. So it doesn't mean it's easy, but
yeah, I'll piggyback on that. It is what you're controllable within the situation, because I'm in Texas, so hockey is just fairly new in the area. And for a while we didn't have enough rinks. And so teams were practicing at 1 a.m. So kids would have to go home, get a couple-hour nap, wake up, do their homework, go practice in the middle of the night, go home, get a little nap, and then go to school.
That's crazy.
It's fucked up. I mean, that's not good for kids. And yet that's what the ice rink availability was. And that's what they were doing. Right. And so with that, you're not able to change that. You can't get, they're not going to quit. They're not going to do that. So what are your controllables? And so it's always looking for that, the low hanging fruit, whatever that be, but what can you actually possibly control? Sometimes it is, okay, well, maybe if the coach knows that they're the club coach knows that this, and I'll tell you, in our area, the club is higher ranking than the high school for most of these players, because when they go play on their club team, they're playing against other people that are potential D1s. And when they're scouting, that's where the scouts are going. They're not coming to watch them play at high school, because there only maybe 1 or 2 kids on the ice that are D1 level. And when I go to a club tournament, there's going to be 30 or 40 kids that are D1 level. So where do you want to go if you're recruiting, right? So oftentimes it may be the high school coach that needs to be the one that you have the chat with about, hey, they're doing X, Y, and Z, and we need to control their total training load. So the sprints aren't going to be good for them right now, or this isn't going to be that, or can we do something else that's a little bit different? They're still going to be a great athlete because they're getting the other rink time. They're getting everything else. They're still going to play well for you. But if you're burning them out here and they're burning them out there, we're not going to have that win, right? And so you're going to have an athlete that's not performing, and that's not going to be good for you. And their job's on the line. Usually the other coaches got another job, but and so there's a different way to play that sometimes. And so, but looking for those angles, because it's hard. There's no way to control all those factors.
I think control the controllables, or at least pick one and go after it is at least a good start, Cassidy.
Well, I think that's a good topic right there too, because at some point you need to kind of figure out, okay, where's your priorities at? Like, how committed to this process are you, right? I think a lot of times people like to think that they can kind of have this all and not have to make any changes. So at some point, I think you need to have kind of the hard conversations with the people to be like, okay, how important is this to you? Like, how committed to this are you? And where are your priorities currently at, right? So if you're talking with someone that's younger, they want to go play in college or something like that, it's like, okay, well, if this is important to you, there are going to have to be some concessions made, and you have to be willing to make sacrifices somewhere else in your life, right? I think sometimes people are falsely kind of led to believe that, they can kind of do all these certain things. But at some point, like you mentioned, Paul, like there's things that are not going to be in your control. So where can we kind of shave off some of the fat, so to speak, because it comes down to the person. They're going to have to make a decision at some point as, what's their top priority. And if they can come to a firm answer on that, then you can start to implement some of these things. But if you're just running around where this person's trying to, engage in all of these things and they haven't really kind of delineated what's more important than something else, I don't think you get anywhere doing that. So you have to make, hard choices and decisions at some point.
Piggybacking off of that, kind of teaching mindfulness on top of prioritizing, teaching them to be aware of, maybe you slept 4 hours last night and you performed pretty badly in practice or in your event the next day, or, there are so many different factors that go into performance. And we talked about how some people do function on a little bit less sleep than that 7 to 8 hour window. So just being mindful of what factors are going into your performance and, if one of them's deficient, how that's really affecting that outcome. So, I mean, yes, they're going to have to prioritize things, but being mindful of what those factors are to begin with, I think is a great way to get them to start considering those more.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You and Kevin kind of getting at this whole, like, ultimately, and Paul too, everybody really, ultimately it's going to be their choice. And I think helping them, nudging them to kind of see how these things can play a part, getting them to acknowledge their own limitations or things that they can improve upon, and then ultimately almost getting them to verbalize whether they are willing to make the changes or willing to have the conversation, creating awareness and then willingness. And that could be something that's revisited over and over, but I think that will probably create, if there's going to be change that's going to be made, that's probably going to create it versus just lecturing them. Like, this is what you need to do. You need to do this is important. You're not doing it. Those types of things. So I think that's really important. Okay, Sean, good night, he says. Good Journal Club. Yeah. So a lot of you guys on the East Coast are probably like, God damn it. And like, just to give context, we're all here, clinicians, coaches, students, we're talking about this stuff. And I guarantee you that we could all improve upon things in our life. So just imagine how hard it is for people who don't have the background, don't have the education, aren't thinking about it in the way that we are, how hard it is then for them to conceptualize the importance of these things sometimes. And so, Kevin, parting thoughts on your end?
I think, like you mentioned, kind of having some sort of toolbox to address these things. Don't just come with, an empty sort of suggestion. Be able to kind of back up what you're saying with something that's actionable. And, I think the theme of the night was, kind of like what Paul was saying and yourself, is being able to just start somewhere and slowly be consistent and stack one thing on top of the other is probably the best thing that we can do from us there. But in terms of that, I'd say, at some point we have to make choices and prioritize what's the real priority. And if you're not willing to make some sort of sacrifice or concession somewhere, then, I don't know how much you're really going to get out of looking at somebody's sleep habits if they're not willing to kind of have some ownership in the process overall. So I think being able to make a decision on what's important to you and then having something actionable to help kind of facilitate and guide them on that path forward is probably the best thing that I think we can do.
Maybe we could all here as a group decide on one thing that we could change for ourselves or work on for ourselves. Maybe this next week or next couple of weeks, like, what's that one thing that I could implement going forward? Maybe it's a sleep diary, like they talked about in the paper. I think that's a low cost thing that kind of keeps you accountable. As long as you're honest with yourself, that could at least give you a kind of oh, wow, I didn't realize I was drinking that much caffeine, or, I didn't realize I was going to bed that late so consistently, those types of things. So buy the lockbox. I love it. Okay, so we'll end it. This was a really good meeting, guys. Megan, do we have okay, there it is. In the chat, open up that link, because that is a feedback form. And anything that we've ever done for these journal clubs has been based on the feedback that we get from you guys. So Social media time locks is huge too. Yeah, Cassidy. So most phones now just have that, like all iPhones, you can just swipe right and you see like your social media time and each app time and your phone screen time. And it gets scary sometimes. He's like, what the hell was I doing? Like, how is that even possible? So these are all things that we can improve upon. But this one was fun. We will need topics for the next one. So if you're in the forum, drop some topics in the planning thread, and then we'll do the public vote like we always do. And until then, we will sleep well tonight, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all. Later.
Thank you.